My name is Aurora Winters, and until a few weeks ago, I was nothing more than a ghost walking through fluorescent-lit hallways of one of the most powerful corporations in the city, Sterling Apex Industries. You know the type of place I'm talking about. The kind where you work unpaid overtime until your eyes burn, where you smile at people who treat you like you're something they accidentally stepped in, where you pretend not to notice when they deliberately talk over you in meetings, or forget your name even though you've worked there for 3 years, or take credit for the reports you spent entire nights perfecting. But nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing, compared to the special kind of hell that was working directly under Cassandra Blackwell, the chief financial officer. They called her the Iron Empress of Sterling Apex. Some people said it with admiration, others said it with fear. I said it with the kind of exhaustion that settles into your bones and never quite leaves. I was her personal assistant, which is a polite way of saying I was her verbal punching bag, her coffee-fetching servant, her scapegoat for every single thing that went wrong in her perfectly curated empire. And I took it, day after day, week after week, because I needed this job, because I had student loans that laughed at my paycheck, because my mother was sick, and the medical bills kept coming like waves I couldn't stop, because I had convinced myself that if I could just survive long enough, maybe things would get better. Spoiler alert, they got worse before they got better. But on that day, that horrible, humiliating, soul-crushing day when everything started to unravel, I had no idea that my entire life was about to change, that the man who would become my protector, my confidant, and something far more complicated was watching everything unfold. His name was Elias Steele, and he would become the reason I learned to stop disappearing. It was a Tuesday. I remember because Tuesdays were always the worst. Cassandra scheduled her most important meetings on Tuesdays, which meant I had to arrive at 6 in the morning to prepare everything to her impossible standard. That particular Tuesday, we had international investors flying in from London and Singapore. The entire executive floor was buzzing with that electric anxiety that happens when millions of dollars hang in the balance. The conference room had been transformed. Fresh flowers I'd personally arranged at 5:30 that morning, catered breakfast from the expensive place downtown that Cassandra insisted on, presentation materials I'd quadruple-checked the night before. I thought I had covered everything. I really did. But there's something you need to understand about Cassandra Blackwell. She didn't just want perfection. She wanted the opportunity to find flaws so she could remind everyone in the room exactly how much power she held. And her favorite target was always me. The meeting started smoothly. Cassandra was in her element, commanding the room with that razor-sharp intelligence she wielded like a weapon. The investors were impressed. I could see it in their faces, the way they leaned forward when she spoke, the way they nodded at her projections. I stood in the corner of the room like I always did, invisible, holding my tablet in case she needed anything. My role was to be ready for anything while making sure no one actually noticed I existed. I had perfected this particular skill over 3 years of practice. Everything was going perfectly, until I brought her the coffee. I had prepared it exactly the way she demanded. 1.5 shots of espresso, precisely 140 degrees Fahrenheit, with a 1/4 inch of foam, served in her specific white ceramic cup that had to be warmed beforehand. The spoon had to be placed at exactly 3 o'clock on the saucer. But that morning, in my exhaustion from having arrived so early, from having stayed so late the night before, from the constant, grinding anxiety of trying to anticipate her every need, I placed the spoon at 4 o'clock instead of 3. 4 o'clock instead of 3. The room went silent in a way that made my stomach drop. That terrible, heavy silence that happens right before something awful is about to occur. Cassandra looked down at the cup I'd just placed in front of her. Then she looked up at me, and I saw something flash in her eyes that I had seen before, but never quite this intense. It was contempt mixed with opportunity. She had found her opening. She picked up the spoon slowly, deliberately, and held it up to the light like she was examining evidence at a crime scene. Then she spoke, and her voice cut through the quiet room like a blade through silk. She told me I was incompetent. That word echoed in my head even now. Incompetent. She said it slowly, letting each syllable land like a physical blow. She told the entire room, including these international investors who had flown across the world, that I couldn't even handle the simple task of serving coffee properly, that I was a waste of the company's resources, that I was, and I remember this phrase exactly because it's burned into my memory, a line item on the budget that should have been eliminated months ago. Some people in the room laughed, uncomfortable laughs, the kind people make when they're witnessing something cruel but don't want to be seen as weak by defending the victim. Others looked down at their papers, suddenly fascinated by the profit margins they'd already reviewed. No one defended me. No one said anything. I stood there, my hands shaking so badly I had to clasp them behind my back to hide it. I could feel my face burning with shame, could feel the tears building up behind my eyes that I absolutely could not let fall. Not there. Not in front of everyone. I wanted to disappear. I wanted the floor to open up and swallow me whole. I wanted to be anywhere but in that room, being dissected by her words while people who could have stopped it chose to look away instead. I whispered an apology. My voice came out wrong, too small, too broken. I apologized for the spoon placement. I apologized for existing in that moment. I apologized for everything. Cassandra waved her hand dismissively, turning back to the investors with a smile that made me feel even smaller. She made a joke about the help these days, and everyone laughed again, relieved that the tension had broken, grateful that they could move on and pretend nothing had happened. But something had happened. Something had shifted inside me in that moment. For the first time in 3 years, underneath the shame and humiliation, I felt something else stirring, something that felt dangerously close to anger. The meeting continued. I stayed in my corner, doing my job, being invisible again. But inside, I was breaking apart. If you think that was the worst of it, you'd be wrong. Cassandra wasn't finished with me, not by a long shot. After the meeting ended and the investors left for their hotel, after the conference room had been cleaned and everyone had returned to their offices, Cassandra called me into her office. I went, like I always did, expecting another list of impossible tasks, another reminder of my inadequacy. Instead, she told me I needed to learn discipline, that I had embarrassed her in front of important people, that there needed to be consequences for my incompetence. Then she pointed to 17 boxes stacked against her wall, heavy archive boxes filled with old financial records that needed to be moved to storage. She told me I would carry them down to the parking garage, all of them, alone, right now. I looked at the boxes, then at her. She was watching me with this expression I couldn't quite read. It was almost like she was curious, like she was conducting an experiment to see exactly how much I would take before I finally broke. I should have said no. I should have gone to HR, should have stood up for myself, should have done 1,000 things differently. But I was scared. Scared of losing this job I needed so desperately. Scared of what she might do to sabotage any future employment if I defied her. Scared because I'd spent 3 years learning that compliance was safer than confrontation. So I started carrying the boxes. The first 3 trips weren't too bad. Heavy, but manageable. By the 5th trip, my arms were starting to shake. By the 7th, my back was screaming in protest. And then, because apparently the universe has a sick sense of humor, it started to rain. Not a gentle rain, a downpour. The kind that soaks through your clothes in seconds and turns the world into a blurry, gray nightmare. I kept carrying the boxes. Rain plastered my hair to my face. My white blouse became transparent and clung to my skin. My shoes, cheap flats I'd bought on sale, filled with water and made squelching sounds with every step. The cardboard boxes started to disintegrate in my hand, the corners going soft and threatening to spill their contents onto the concrete. Other employees walked past me in the parking garage. Some looked away quickly, others slowed down, their faces showing brief flashes of sympathy before they hurried on. No one stopped to help. No one wanted to risk getting on Cassandra's bad side. I was on my 14th box when I felt something inside me finally start to crack. Not just my body, which was exhausted beyond anything I'd felt before, but something deeper. Something in my spirit that had been holding on by sheer force of will was finally giving way. I set the box down for a moment, leaning against a concrete pillar, trying to catch my breath. The rain was so loud I could barely hear my own thoughts. Water dripped from my hair, my clothes, mixing with tears I hadn't even realized I was crying. And that's when I heard the car. At first, it was just the sound of an engine, smooth and expensive, different from the typical commuter cars in the garage. Then headlights cut through the rain-blurred darkness, moving slowly in my direction. The car was black, not regular black, but that deep, glossy black that screams money and power. It was also clearly armored, the kind of vehicle someone very important needs when they want to feel safe. It pulled up right beside me and stopped. The engine idled quietly, a purr that somehow felt louder than the rain. I stood there, frozen, dripping water, clutching a disintegrating box of financial records, wondering what fresh hell was about to unfold. Then the back door opened. I'd seen him before, but only in photographs. In the glossy annual reports that got distributed to shareholders, in the business section of newspapers when major deals were announced, in the company newsletter that no one really read but everyone pretended to. Elias Steele, son of the founder, the heir apparent, the man who actually owned Sterling Apex Industries but almost never appeared in public. There were rumors about him, of course. In a company this size, there were always rumors. Some people said he was a genius who preferred to work behind the scene. Others said he was damaged somehow, scarred by a childhood in the spotlight, choosing anonymity over fame. A few claimed he was ruthless, that he'd forced out executives who'd worked alongside his father for decades. I'd never paid much attention to the rumors because Elias Steele existed in a completely different world than mine. He was stratosphere-level management. I was basement-level support staff. Our paths would never cross, except now they were crossing. He was stepping out of that expensive black car, moving toward me through the rain with an umbrella that seemed almost comically inadequate for the downpour. And I was standing there looking like something that had been fished out of a river. He was taller than I'd imagined from the photos, mid-30s maybe, dark hair that was slightly too long for corporate standards, like he didn't care about those particular rules. Sharp features that might have seemed harsh except for his eyes, which were this unusual shade of gray-blue that looked almost silver in certain light. But what struck me most wasn't his appearance. It was the expression on his face. He looked angry, not at me, but at the situation, at what he was seeing. He stopped a few feet away, holding the umbrella over both of us now, and asked me a question that seemed so simple but felt impossibly complicated. He asked me why I was doing this alone. I froze, every muscle in my body locked up, because answering that question truthfully could cost me everything. But lying to Elias Steele seemed equally dangerous. I told him, my voice barely audible over the rain, that it was under orders from Director Blackwell. I kept my eyes down, staring at the puddle forming around my ruined shoes, waiting for him to tell me to hurry up or get back to work or stop wasting his time. Instead, he was quiet for a long moment, long enough that I finally looked up. He was studying me, not the way Cassandra studied me, looking for flaws to exploit. This was different. He was looking at me like I was a puzzle he was trying to solve, like he was seeing something in me that I couldn't see in myself. Then he asked me something that made my breath catch. He asked if this was the first time this had happened. I should have lied. I should have said yes, protected Cassandra, protected my job, protected the fragile stability of my life. But I was so tired, so completely exhausted by years of pretending everything was fine when it absolutely wasn't. So I told him the truth. I told him it wasn't the first time, that there had been other tasks, other punishments, other public humiliations designed to remind me of my place in the hierarchy. I told him all of this while standing in the rain, shivering, holding a box of records that no longer seemed important at all. Something changed in his expression. The anger that had been simmering beneath the surface intensified. But again, it wasn't directed at me. He looked like someone who'd just confirmed something he'd suspected, like he'd just seen proof of something that made him furious. He told me to go home, to change into dry clothes, to take the rest of the day off. He said he would handle the remaining boxes and he would handle the situation. I started to protest because that's what I'd been trained to do, to minimize, to apologize, to insist I could handle it. But he cut me off gently, firmly, telling me that I'd done more than enough and it was time for someone else to take responsibility. Then he did something that nearly made me start crying again. He took the box from my hands, his fingers brushing mine for just a second, and told me that no one should have to earn their dignity, that it should be given freely, especially by those who have power over others. A car pulled up, his driver, offering to take me home. I climbed into the back seat of that expensive car, still dripping water everywhere, barely able to process what had just happened. As we pulled away, I looked back through the rain-streaked window. Elias Steele was standing there in the downpour, no longer bothering with the umbrella, staring at the boxes like he was memorizing the scene, like he was turning something over in his mind, like he was making decisions that would change everything. I just didn't know it yet. I called in sick the next day. Not because I was physically ill, though my body ached from carrying all those boxes, but because I couldn't face going back to that building, to that office, to Cassandra's inevitable fury over whatever had transpired after I left. I spent the day in my tiny apartment, wrapped in blankets despite the warm weather, drinking tea that did nothing to chase away the cold that had settled in my bones. I kept replaying everything in my mind. The meeting, the boxes, the rain. Elias Steele's face when he looked at me like I mattered. That last part scared me more than anything else, because mattering meant being visible, and being visible meant being vulnerable. And being vulnerable to someone with that much power felt dangerous in ways I couldn't quite articulate. My phone buzzed constantly with messages from other assistants asking where I was, if I was okay, if I'd heard what was happening at the office. I ignored them all. I wasn't ready to know. I needed one more day of pretending the world wasn't about to shift beneath my feet. But the next morning, I had to go back. Bills don't pause for existential crises. Student loans don't care about your emotional state. So I put on my most professional outfit, styled my hair carefully, applied makeup to hide how little I'd slept, and walked back into Sterling Apex Industries like I was walking into battle. The moment I stepped off the elevator onto our floor, I knew something was wrong. The energy was different. People were clustered in small groups, whispering urgently, then falling silent when they noticed me. Eyes followed me as I walked to my desk. Some looked sympathetic. Others looked curious. A few looked almost hungry, like they were waiting for something dramatic to unfold. My desk was exactly as I'd left it 2 days ago. Computer still on, showing the screensaver I'd set. Coffee mug, now containing cold coffee with a film on top. Post-it notes with reminders for tasks I'd need to complete. Everything normal, except nothing felt normal at all. Then I heard the sound that made my blood run cold. High heels on marble floor. The distinctive click-clack rhythm that I'd learned to recognize instantly over 3 years. Cassandra's approach. I turned, already forming an apology in my mind for missing yesterday, already preparing to grovel and beg and do whatever necessary to keep my job. But the woman striding down the hallway toward me looked nothing like the composed, controlled Cassandra Blackwell I knew. Her usually perfect hair was slightly disheveled. Her makeup was more severe than usual, like war paint, and her expression was pure, undiluted rage. She was carrying a box. Not archive boxes like the ones I'd been hauling through the rain. A personal box, the kind you pack when you're leaving somewhere in a hurry. She stopped directly in front of my desk, and for a moment we just stared at each other. I could see her jaw clenching, could see the way her perfectly manicured nails were digging into the cardboard of the box. Then she spoke, and her voice was ice wrapped around broken glass. She told me I should be very proud of myself, that I'd successfully destroyed her career, that running crying to the heir apparent was a cowardly move that she'd expected from someone like me, that I was too weak, too pathetic, too useless to fight my own battles, so I had to hide behind someone with actual power. I wanted to defend myself, to tell her I hadn't run to anyone, that I hadn't complained or asked for help, but my voice wouldn't work. I just stood there, frozen, as she continued her verbal assault. She told me she was being removed from her position, temporarily, she emphasized with bitter sarcasm. She said that an investigation had been launched into her management practices, that HR was suddenly very interested in speaking with multiple employees about the work environment she'd created, that someone very high up in the company had personally intervened to ensure she couldn't retaliate against anyone who spoke up. Other employees were starting to gather now, drawn by the commotion. I could feel their eyes on us, could hear whispered conversation. This was becoming a spectacle. Another public humiliation, except this time I wasn't the target. Cassandra leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow felt more threatening than her earlier volume. She told me that this wasn't over, that temporary removals often became permanent positions somewhere else, that people with her connections didn't just disappear, that I should watch my back because she had a very long memory and an even longer reach. Then she straightened up, adjusted the box in her arms, and walked toward the elevators with her head high. She didn't look back, didn't say goodbye to anyone, just walked away like she was making an exit from a stage, maintaining her dignity even in defeat. The moment the elevator doors closed behind her, the entire floor erupted into conversation. People rushed to my desk, asking what happened, demanding details, treating me like I was suddenly the most interesting person in the building. I couldn't process any of it. I felt numb, disconnected, like I was watching everything happen to someone else. That's when my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Short, simple, but it changed everything. It said, "You deserved respect. I simply ensured you received it. S. Elias Steele. He'd done this. He'd seen what happened in the rain, and he'd acted. He'd used his power not to hurt me, but to protect me, to protect everyone she'd been hurting for years." I sank into my desk chair, staring at those words on my screen, and felt something crack open inside my chest. It wasn't fear this time. It wasn't anxiety or dread or the exhausting anticipation of the next disaster. It was something that felt dangerous and terrifying and impossibly fragile. It was hope. 3 days passed in strange, surreal calm. Without Cassandra's constant presence, the office felt different, lighter somehow. People smiled more, made jokes, took actual lunch breaks instead of eating at their desks while frantically working. It was like someone had lifted a heavy blanket that had been suffocating everyone, and we were all slowly remembering how to breathe normally. But I couldn't quite relax. I kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, for Cassandra to return with a vengeance, for everything to snap back to the way it was, for someone to realize that I wasn't worth all this disruption and quietly suggest I find employment elsewhere. The text from Elias haunted me. I must have read it 100 times, analyzing every word, wondering what he meant, if he meant anything beyond the surface level, if I was reading intention into something that was simply a powerful man correcting an injustice. I didn't respond. What could I possibly say? Thank you felt inadequate. Anything else felt presumptuous. So I saved the number in my phone under ES and tried to focus on my work. Except I no longer reported to anyone. Cassandra was gone. No replacement had been named. I showed up every day and did my tasks as best I could without direction, feeling increasingly like a satellite that had lost its orbit. Until the 4th day, when I received a message from Executive Administration, a formal request, delivered via company email with all the proper protocols. I was being asked to deliver a portfolio of documents directly to the executive suite, to Elias Steele's personal office, today at 3 in the afternoon. My hands shook as I read the email. This wasn't unusual in theory. Assistants delivered documents all the time. But it was unusual for me. I'd never been to the executive suite. That was Cassandra's domain, not mine. I existed several floors below, in the realm of regular employees who kept the company running without ever glimpsing the machinery at the top. I spent my lunch break in the bathroom, giving myself a stern talking to in the mirror. This was just a document delivery, professional, simple. I would walk in, hand over the portfolio, Maybe exchange basic pleasantries and leave. Nothing complicated, nothing dangerous. Except it felt dangerous, because I couldn't stop thinking about how he'd looked at me in the rain, how he'd taken the box from my hands, how he'd sent that text acknowledging what he'd done, how he'd used the word deserved. Like my dignity was something that should have been protected all along. At 2:50, I collected the portfolio from my desk. It was surprisingly thin for something requiring personal delivery, just a few contracts that needed signatures. I could have scanned and emailed them. Anyone could have brought them up, but the request had been specific. Me, his office, 3 o'clock. The elevator ride to the executive floor felt impossibly long. I watched the numbers climb, each one feeling like a step towards something I couldn't name. The doors opened onto a completely different world, where my floor was functional cubicles and standard office furniture. This was understated luxury. Hardwood floors instead of carpet, original artwork on walls, floor-to-ceiling windows that flooded everything with natural light, a silence that felt intentional, carefully maintained. A receptionist I didn't recognize looked up as I approached, checked something on her computer, and smiled in a way that made me nervous. She told me Mr. Steele was expecting me, that I should go right in. The corner office at the end of the hall. I walked down that hallway feeling like I was in a dream, or a nightmare. I couldn't quite tell which. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure everyone could hear it. I knocked on the door, heard a voice from inside telling me to enter, took a breath that didn't quite fill my lungs, and opened the door. His office was enormous, but somehow not overwhelming. One entire wall was windows overlooking the city. Bookshelves lined another wall, filled with what looked like actual books, not just decorative spines. The desk was massive, but surprisingly cluttered with papers and coffee cups, making it feel used rather than ornamental. And there, standing by the windows with his back to me, was Elias Steele. He turned when I entered, and I was struck again by how different he looked from the polished executive in the corporate photos. His tie was loosened, his sleeves were rolled up. He looked tired in a way that suggested this wasn't just today's exhaustion, but something that had been building for a long time. He smiled when he saw me, but it was a small smile, careful, like he wasn't sure how I'd react to seeing him again. I cleared my throat, held up the portfolio, told him I was there to deliver documents that needed his signature. My voice came out steadier than I expected. Professional, distant, safe. He nodded, gestured for me to set them on his desk, but didn't immediately reach for them. Instead, he asked me how I was doing, really doing, not the polite version we offer strangers, but the real answer. And suddenly I couldn't maintain the professional distance anymore. I set the portfolio down, and words started spilling out before I could stop them. I told him I was confused, that I didn't understand why he'd helped me, that people didn't just do things like that without wanting something in return, that I was waiting for the catch, for the moment when I'd realize what this kindness actually cost. He listened without interrupting. When I finally ran out of words, he was quiet for a moment, like he was choosing his next words carefully. Then he told me something I wasn't expecting. He said he'd been watching me since the day he officially joined the company 6 months ago. That might have sounded creepy, except for the way he explained it. He said he'd been observing how the company actually functioned beyond the quarterly reports and board meeting. He wanted to understand the culture from the ground up. And in doing that, he'd noticed me. He told me he'd seen how hard I worked, how I stayed late even when I wasn't asked to, how I helped other assistants even when I was drowning in my own tasks, how I maintained kindness even when treated with cruelty. He said I reminded him of someone who'd been important to him once, someone who'd been broken by people who should have protected them instead. His voice changed when he said that last part, became quieter, more personal, like he was sharing something he didn't often talk about. Then he said something that made my breath catch. He told me he knew what Cassandra had been doing because he'd experienced something similar. Not in this company, but before, when he was younger. He'd been under someone who'd used their power to systematically break down everyone around them, who'd made him feel worthless, incompetent, like he could never measure up no matter how hard he tried. He said he'd promised himself that if he ever had the power to stop that from happening to someone else, he would use it. No hesitation, no second guessing, because he knew exactly how it felt to be where I'd been standing in that parking garage, and he refused to let it continue under his watch. I didn't know what to say. This man, this powerful, untouchable heir to an empire, was telling me he understood, that he'd been hurt in ways that echoed my own pain, that his intervention wasn't about pity or obligation, but about recognition, about seeing someone going through what he'd survived and refusing to look away. I asked him why he was telling me this, why he was sharing something so personal with someone he barely knew. He moved away from the windows, sat on the edge of his desk instead of behind it, eliminating some of the formality. Then he said something that changed everything. He told me that he'd noticed something else about me during those 6 months of observation. He said I never lost my humanity despite working in an environment that actively punished it, that I never became hard or cynical or cruel even when it would have been easier, that I maintained something genuine in a place that valued performance over authenticity. He said those were rare qualities, especially here, especially at this level of corporate machinery. And he wanted to protect that, not just for my sake, but because the company needed people who still remembered how to be human. Then he asked me something that made my heart stutter. He asked if I'd consider working directly for him, as his executive assistant, reporting to him instead of to whatever replacement they found for Cassandra. I must have looked shocked because he quickly clarified. He said it wasn't a favor or charity, that he genuinely needed someone he could trust, someone who understood the company from the ground up, someone who wouldn't just tell him what he wanted to hear. He said all of this while looking directly at me with those unusual gray-blue eyes that seemed to see more than I was comfortable revealing. I told him I didn't understand, that I was just an assistant, that I didn't have the qualifications for a position like that there were dozens of people more experienced, more educated, more everything than me. But he shook his head. He said experience could be taught, education could be provided. What couldn't be taught was integrity, loyalty, the ability to maintain compassion in a ruthless environment. And those were the qualities he needed most. He wasn't offering me a handout, he said. He was offering me an opportunity to prove I was exactly as capable as he believed I was. And if I wanted to refuse, if I wanted to stay in my current position or even leave the company entirely, he would understand and support that decision. No pressure, no consequences, just an offer. I stood there in his enormous office, looking at this man who'd protected me without asking for anything in return, who'd shared his own pain to help me understand his motivation, who was now offering me a future I'd never dared to imagine, and I felt something shift inside me. For 3 years, I'd made myself small, invisible, unworthy of attention. I'd accepted cruelty as the price of employment. I'd convinced myself that survival was the same thing as success. But maybe, just maybe, I deserved more than survival. Maybe I deserved to be seen, to be valued, to take up space without apologizing for it. I told him I'd think about it, that I needed time to process everything. He nodded, said that was smart, that major decisions shouldn't be made impulsively. He handed me a card with his direct contact information and told me to reach out when I'd decided. As I walked out of his office, portfolio forgotten on his desk, I realized something profound had shifted. For the first time in 3 years, I wasn't walking out of a superior's office feeling diminished. I was walking out feeling seen. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. My mind was racing too fast, spinning through scenarios and possibilities and fears that multiplied every time I tried to examine them. Working directly for Elias Steele, it should have been an easy decision. A promotion, more money, presumably, better visibility in the company, access to opportunities I'd never have otherwise. It was the kind of career advancement people competed viciously for. But nothing about it felt simple, because I'd seen what happened to people who got too close to power, how they changed, how they started making compromises they swore they never would, how they sacrificed pieces of themselves until they didn't recognize who they'd become. And there was something else, something I was afraid to examine too closely. The way my heart had skipped when he'd looked at me in his office, the way I'd wanted to stay in that conversation longer, to learn more about the person behind the executive persona, the way I'd noticed details I shouldn't have noticed, like how his eyes had these tiny flecks of darker blue, or how his voice dropped when he talked about painful memories. This wasn't just about a job offer. This was about proximity to someone who'd already affected me more than was safe, who'd already made me feel things I had no business feeling. I spent the next 2 days in a state of paralyzed indecision. I made lists of pros and cons that canceled each other out. I rehearsed conversations in my head where I accepted, where I declined, where I asked for more time. Nothing felt right. Meanwhile, the office buzzed with speculation. Word had gotten out that Elias Steele was personally interviewing for a new executive assistant. Several people from other departments had already applied. I overheard conversations about who was most qualified, who had the best chance, what the position must pay. No one knew he'd already offered it to me. I'd told no one, partly because I still hadn't decided, mostly because I didn't know how to explain that the man who owned the company had chosen me, of all people, for one of the most coveted positions in Sterling Apex. On the 3rd night, I called my mother. She was having one of her better days, her voice clearer than it had been in weeks. I didn't tell her about the job offer specifically, but I asked her something I'd been carrying around since that meeting in his office. I asked her if it was possible to trust someone with power, if powerful people could genuinely care about people beneath them without some ulterior motive, if protection ever came without strings attached. She was quiet for a long time. Then she told me something I'll never forget. She said that power doesn't make people good or bad. It just makes them more of what they already are. That the question wasn't whether I could trust someone with power. It was whether I could trust the person behind that power, and the only way to know was to risk being wrong. After we hung up, I sat in the darkness of my apartment, her words echoing in my mind. Risk being wrong. The story of my life was about avoiding risk, playing it safe, making myself small enough that failure couldn't find me. But maybe that was just another form of failure. Maybe refusing to reach for something better because I was afraid of falling was its own kind of defeat. I picked up my phone, pulled up Elias's contact information, and before I could overthink it, I typed a message. Short, simple, terrifying. I told him I'd like to accept his offer, if it was still available, if he was still sure. The response came faster than I expected. Just 3 words that somehow felt like a promise and a challenge all at once. I'm still sure. My first day reporting directly to Elias Steele felt like stepping into an alternate reality, a version of Sterling Apex Industries where I had a voice, where my opinions mattered, where people treated me like I belonged there. His previous executive assistant had transferred to another division weeks ago, apparently at his request. He'd wanted a fresh start, he explained. Someone without preconceived notions about how things should be done. Someone willing to question systems that didn't make sense. That someone was apparently me. The work was intense. Elias didn't work normal hours. He was in the office by 6 most mornings and rarely left before 8 at night. He traveled frequently, met with board members and investors and department heads. He read every report, questioned every assumption, pushed back on strategies that prioritized short-term profit over long-term sustainability. And he expected me to keep up, to understand not just the logistics of his schedule, but the strategy behind it, to anticipate needs I didn't yet know how to recognize, to learn quickly and admit when I didn't know something rather than pretending I did. It should have been overwhelming, probably would have been, for the person I was 3 weeks ago. But something had changed in me since that day in the rain. Some internal switch had flipped. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was actually trying. And Elias noticed. He thanked me when I did good work, corrected me gently when I made mistakes, took time to explain the context behind decisions so I could better understand what he needed, treated me like a partner in his work, rather than just a facilitator of it. But it was the small moments that really got to me. The way he asked how my mother was doing after I'd mentioned her health struggles once in passing. The way he made sure I actually took my lunch break instead of working through it. The way he'd occasionally share frustrations about board politics or family expectations, like I was someone he could trust with his unfiltered thoughts. We developed rhythms. Morning briefings over coffee where he'd outline the day's priorities. Afternoon check-ins where we'd troubleshoot problems as they arose. Late evening conversations when most of the building was empty and he'd still be working through strategy documents, sometimes thinking out loud while I listened, and occasionally offered perspectives he hadn't considered. Those late evening conversations were dangerous. Not professionally. The work was always appropriate, always focused on company matters, but personally, because in those moments, when the formal distance of executive and assistant blurred into something closer to colleagues or maybe even friends, I saw more of who he actually was. I learned that he'd traveled extensively before joining the company full-time, that he spoke 4 languages fluently, that he'd walked away from the family business for 5 years after university, trying to build something of his own, only to be pulled back when his father's health declined, that he loved the work, but resented the dynasty, that he wanted to transform Sterling Apex into something better, but faced constant resistance from old guard board members who preferred tradition over innovation. I learned that he was lonely at the top, that the weight of carrying an empire came with an isolation he hadn't expected, that the person he'd mentioned before, the one who'd been broken by someone in power, had been his younger sister, that watching her suffer while he was too young and powerless to help had shaped everything about who he became afterward. And in sharing all of this, he made space for me to share too. So I told him things I'd never told anyone at Sterling Apex. About my father, who'd left when I was 12. About the poverty that had defined my teenage years. About how I'd put myself through community college while working 3 jobs. About my mother's illness and the medical debt that felt like drowning in slow motion. About the shame I'd carried for years about not being enough, not having enough, not deserving more. He listened to all of it without judgment, without pity, just recognition that life had been harder for me than it should have been, and acknowledgement that I'd survived it with my humanity intact. Looking back, I can pinpoint the exact moment everything changed between us. It was a Thursday evening, about 3 weeks into my new position. We were alone in his office, reviewing contracts for a major acquisition. It was past 10 at night. The building was empty except for security. He was explaining something about liability clauses when he suddenly stopped mid-sentence. Just looked at me with this expression I couldn't read. It wasn't professional distance. It wasn't the careful neutrality he maintained in meetings. It was something raw and honest and entirely unguarded. Then he did something that made my heart stutter. He told me he needed to be honest with me about something, that he'd been trying to maintain appropriate boundaries, but it was becoming increasingly difficult. That working with me every day, getting to know me, seeing how brilliant I actually was when given the space to be, it had complicated things in ways he hadn't anticipated. I knew what he was saying. I'd felt it too, that pull between us that had nothing to do with hierarchy or employment, and everything to do with recognition, with seeing and being seen, with finding someone who understood parts of you that you'd thought were incomprehensible. But I also knew what this could cost. Office romances were risky under the best circumstances. A relationship between the owner's son and his assistant, that was career suicide. Fodder for gossip, proof that I'd only been promoted because of something inappropriate rather than my actual abilities. I told him we couldn't, that I couldn't, that I'd just started to believe I might actually deserve this job based on merit, and anything between us would destroy that, would make me question everything, would make everyone else question it too. He nodded slowly, and I could see the disappointment in his face even as he agreed. He said he understood, that he wouldn't push, that we'd maintain professional boundaries no matter what he personally felt, that my career and reputation mattered more than his feeling. And he kept that promise. Over the following days, we went back to being executive and assistant, polite, professional, appropriate. But something had shifted. We both knew what was underneath the formal distance now, what was being carefully not acknowledged, what was growing despite our best efforts to contain it. It was like trying to ignore a fire. You could pretend it wasn't there, could act like the smoke wasn't choking you, but that didn't make it any less real. If our story had been simpler, maybe we could have maintained that careful distance indefinitely, kept working together, kept ignoring the tension that crackled in the air whenever we were in the same room, kept pretending we were just executive and assistant and nothing more. But then Cassandra came back, not physically. Her temporary removal had become a permanent termination after the HR investigation had uncovered years of documented complaints that had been systematically buried by people who'd benefited from her protection. She was gone from Sterling Apex, and there was no coming back. But her influence remained, her allies, her network, the people who'd risen alongside her, and were now vulnerable to the same scrutiny she'd faced. One of them was Marcus Chen, the chief operating officer, a man who'd worked alongside Cassandra for 8 years, who'd covered for her, who'd helped silence complaints, who'd built his own reputation on similar tactics of intimidation and control. And Marcus Chen did not appreciate the new direction Elias was taking the company, didn't appreciate the increased scrutiny on management practices, didn't appreciate that the heir apparent was actually trying to change things rather than maintaining the status quo. He especially didn't appreciate that Elias's executive assistant, that nobody who'd somehow gotten promoted way above her station, might have information about how the old regime had actually operated. I first noticed his interest during an executive meeting. Elias had brought me to take notes, which was standard practice. But throughout the meeting, I felt Marcus watching me, not subtly, intently, like he was trying to figure out exactly how much I knew and how much of a threat I posed. After the meeting, he approached me in the hallway, smiled that practiced executive smile that doesn't reach the eyes, told me it was impressive how far I'd come, how working directly for Mr. Steele must be quite an opportunity, how he'd heard I'd been very helpful during the investigation into Ms. Blackwell's management practices. His tone was friendly, his words were compliments, but everything about the interaction felt like a warning. I reported it to Elias immediately. I'd learned that silence protected abusers, and I wasn't going to make that mistake again. He listened with increasing concern, then made a decision that changed everything. He told me I needed protection, not just professionally, but physically, that Marcus had a history of retaliating against people he viewed as threats, and I'd just been identified as one. He said he was assigning personal security to me, effective immediately. I laughed, actually laughed, because the idea of me needing security seemed absurd. I was nobody, a former invisible assistant who'd gotten lucky. Why would anyone waste resources threatening me? But Elias wasn't laughing. He explained that I wasn't nobody anymore, that I'd been present for confidential meetings, that I'd provided testimony during the HR investigation, that I had access to his schedule, his communications, his strategies, that harming me was a way to harm him, and Marcus knew it. He also said something else, something that made my breath catch. He said he couldn't stand the idea of me being hurt because of him, that he'd already failed to protect someone he cared about once before, and he wouldn't let it happen again, that I mattered to him in ways that went beyond professional, and he wasn't going to apologize for acting on that. The security started the next day, a driver who picked me up and dropped me off, someone who shadowed me whenever I left the executive floor. It felt excessive, paranoid, until I found the first note. It was slipped under my apartment door. No signature, just a message printed on plain paper. It told me I should reconsider my loyalties, that Elias Steele wasn't who I thought he was, that I was being used and would be discarded when I was no longer useful, that if I was smart, I'd start looking for employment elsewhere before things got complicated. I brought it to Elias immediately. His face went very still when he read it. Then he made a phone call. his voice cold in a way I'd never heard before. Within hours, building security at my apartment was upgraded. The threats were reported to authorities. An investigation was launched. And Elias did something else, something I absolutely did not expect. He asked me to move out of my apartment temporarily, to stay somewhere safer until the situation was resolved. He offered to cover the cost of a hotel or short-term rental, said it was company expense since the threats were directly related to my employment. But what he was really offering, though he didn't say it explicitly, was his protection. Not just corporate security measures, personal investment in my safety, acknowledgement that what happened to me mattered to him beyond professional liability. I should have refused, should have maintained boundaries, should have insisted I could handle it myself, but I was scared. Genuinely scared in a way I hadn't been even during the worst days with Cassandra, because this felt different, more dangerous, more calculated. So I accepted his help, moved to a corporate apartment in a secure building, let the security personnel do their job, let Elias worry about me, even though I could see the stress it added to the weight he was already carrying. And in accepting his protection, in letting him care for my safety, the walls we'd carefully constructed between us started to crumble. The threats didn't stop. They escalated. More notes. Anonymous emails sent to my personal account. A suspicious person loitering outside the corporate apartment building until security intervened. All of it carefully designed to frighten without crossing into anything police could definitively act on. Marcus Chen was never directly implicated. He was too smart for that. But everyone knew. The whole executive floor understood what was happening and why. It was a power play, a message. A reminder that the old guard still had influence and weren't going down without a fight. Elias responded by becoming more protective, and I responded by spending more time in his presence, which was the safest place I could be, which meant longer hours together, more late evenings, more moments of unguarded honesty when exhaustion stripped away our carefully maintained professional distance. The night everything finally broke, we were working late on a crisis. A major client was threatening to pull their contract over concerns about Sterling Apex's recent management changes. Elias needed to prepare a presentation for the board showing that the reforms were strengthening the company, not weakening it. It required detailed analysis, precise messaging, absolute perfection. We worked until past midnight. His office became our war room. Coffee cups multiplied. Exhaustion made us punchy. At some point, we transitioned from stressed to slightly delirious, making dark jokes about corporate politics and laughing too hard at things that weren't that funny. Then Elias's phone rang, his father, calling from the hospital. A setback in his treatment, nothing immediately critical, but concerning enough that Elias needed to go there tonight. Right now. I watched his face as he took the call, watched him transform from the confident executive I worked with into someone much younger and more frightened, someone who was still that boy who'd watched his sister suffer and couldn't stop it, who was now watching his father decline and couldn't stop that either. When he hung up, he just stood there for a moment, holding the phone, staring at nothing, and I did something I'd been carefully not doing for weeks. I crossed the professional distance between us and touched him, just my hand on his arm, gentle, offering comfort I wasn't sure he'd accept. He looked down at my hand, then up at my face, and something in his expression just shattered. All the careful control, all the maintained boundaries, all the reasons we'd given ourselves for why this couldn't happen. He told me he was tired, so tired of pretending he didn't feel what he felt, of maintaining appropriate distance from the one person who actually understood him, of denying that I'd become the most important person in his life, not despite the professional relationship, but because of it. Because I'd seen him at his most stressed, most vulnerable, most human, and hadn't turned away. I should have stepped back, should have reasserted boundaries, should have reminded us both of all the reasons this was complicated. But I was tired too. Tired of pretending my heart didn't race whenever he walked into a room, that I didn't look forward to our late-night conversations more than anything else in my day, that I hadn't fallen for him in ways that had nothing to do with his power or his position, and everything to do with who he actually was. So instead of stepping back, I stepped closer. Told him I was tired of pretending too, that I knew this was complicated and potentially career-ending and probably a terrible idea, but that I couldn't keep denying that he'd become essential to me, that he'd seen me when I was invisible, and valued me when I felt worthless, and protected me when I was vulnerable, that he'd given me back my dignity and in doing so had somehow claimed my heart. We stood there in his office, in the middle of the night, with all our careful defenses finally abandoned, and then he kissed me, or I kissed him, or we kissed each other. It didn't matter who initiated it. What mattered was that it felt right in a way that nothing else had in a very long time. It wasn't just attraction, though that was there too. It was recognition, understanding, the relief of finally being able to stop pretending, of acknowledging that what had grown between us was real and important and worth protecting, even if protecting it was complicated. When we finally pulled apart, We were both shaking slightly. He rested his forehead against mine, and I could feel him trying to steady his breathing. Then he said something that made me want to laugh and cry simultaneously. He told me we were both probably going to regret this in the morning, that we'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, that everything was about to get significantly more complicated, but that he couldn't bring himself to regret it now. Not when holding me felt like the first honest thing he'd done in months. I told him I didn't regret it, not even a little. That complicated was better than the alternative, which was continuing to ignore something real because we were afraid of what other people might think or say. He had to leave for the hospital, but before he did, he kissed me again, softer this time, like a promise, told me we'd figure this out together, that we'd face whatever consequences came, that I was worth the complication. After he left, I sat in his office for a long time, touching my lips, trying to process what had just happened. We'd just changed everything. There was no going back to being just executive and assistant, no pretending this was purely professional, no hiding what we felt anymore. And I was terrified, but I was also, for the first time in my entire life, completely certain of something. Whatever happened next, whatever we had to face, we'd face it together. I barely slept that night, kept replaying everything, the kiss, his words, the way he'd looked at me like I was something precious, the realization that we'd crossed into territory that would require navigation we hadn't figured out yet. By the time morning came, I'd cycled through about 17 different emotional states: elation, panic, hope, dread, certainty, doubt, back to elation again. Elias sent me a text at 6 a.m., just checking in, letting me know his father was stable, asking if we could talk before the workday officially started. My heart hammered as I typed back an affirmative. We met in his office at 7, before most people arrived. The moment I saw him, I could tell he'd slept about as much as I had. Dark circles under his eyes, hair slightly disheveled, still in yesterday's clothes like he'd come straight from the hospital. But he smiled when he saw me, that genuine smile I'd only seen a handful of times. And I knew, whatever conversation we were about to have, it wasn't going to be him telling me last night was a mistake. He told me we needed to talk about how to handle this, not the relationship itself, which he made clear he wanted to pursue, but the complications, the optics, the fact that I worked for him and people would make assumptions. He'd already thought it through. Practical solutions to impossible problems. He suggested we keep things private for now. Not secret, but private. No displays at work. Separate professional and personal as much as possible. He'd arranged for me to technically report to his chief of staff instead of directly to him, eliminating the direct power dynamic. If the relationship progressed, he'd make sure I had career opportunities that weren't connected to him, so no one could claim I'd only advanced because of our involvement. He said all of this while looking at me intently, checking to make sure I was okay with each suggestion, making sure I understood he was trying to protect me, not hide me, that he wanted to do this right, even if right was complicated. I told him I appreciated the thought he'd put into it, but I also told him something else, something I'd realized in the sleepless hours of the night. I said I didn't want to be protected at the cost of my own agency, that if we were doing this, I needed to be an equal partner in the decision-making, that I wouldn't go back to being someone who let powerful people make all her choices, even if those choices were well-intentioned. He looked surprised for a moment, then something in his expression shifted to respect. Appreciation. He said he understood, that he wasn't trying to control me, just trying to navigate an impossible situation, that he wanted my input on everything, that we'd figure this out together, making decisions as partners, not as executive and subordinate. We talked for another hour, working through scenarios, discussing potential consequences, agreeing on boundaries and communication strategy. It was probably the least romantic relationship conversation anyone's ever had, but it felt right, mature, honest. Before we finished, he said something that made my chest tight. He told me he'd waited his entire life to find someone who saw him as a person rather than a position, who challenged him, who made him want to be better. He said he'd given up hope of finding that, had resigned himself to the loneliness that came with power. And then I'd appeared, carrying boxes in the rain, refusing to be broken despite everything trying to break me. He said saving me that day hadn't been altruistic. It had been selfish. Because he'd recognized something in me that he desperately needed in his own life. Someone real. Someone who reminded him why any of this mattered. Someone worth protecting because protecting me gave him purpose beyond corporate strategy and family legacy. I didn't have words for that. Still don't, really. So I just kissed him again, trying to communicate everything I couldn't articulate, trying to show him that he wasn't alone anymore, that I saw him too, that we'd found each other in the middle of all this chaos, and that was worth fighting for. The first few weeks of navigating our relationship while maintaining professional boundaries was harder than either of us anticipated. We were good at the separation while at work, maintained appropriate distance, professional interactions. No one who didn't know better would have suspected anything had changed. But the nights were different. Private dinners at his place or the corporate apartment where I was still staying. Conversations that lasted until dawn. Getting to know each other outside the context of sterling apex. Learning the person beneath the positions we held. I learned that Elias collected vintage books but rarely had time to read them. That he played piano beautifully but hadn't touched one in years. That he'd wanted to be an architect before family obligations pulled him into the business. That he carried guilt about his sister that no amount of therapy had quite resolved. He learned about my own dreams that had been deferred by necessity. How I'd wanted to study literature but chose business because it was practical. How I wrote poetry in journals I never showed anyone. How I'd spent years convinced I wasn't worthy of love because poverty had taught me I wasn't worthy of much of anything. We were falling in love. There's no other way to describe it. Falling in that scary, exhilarating, can't-go-back way that changes the fundamental architecture of your life. And we were both terrified because we knew how much we had to lose if this went wrong. Then everything came to a head in the worst possible way. Marcus Chen made his move. Not against me directly, against Elias. A carefully orchestrated campaign to undermine his authority with the board. Allegations that he was making emotional rather than strategic decisions. That his recent reforms were damaging relationships with long-term clients. That he was allowing personal matters to compromise his judgment. That he was too close to his staff, showing inappropriate favoritism. The implications were clear without being explicitly stated. They were coming after our relationship without directly naming it. The emergency board meeting was called for a Friday afternoon. Elias would have to defend his leadership, his vision, his decisions. Everything he'd been working toward was suddenly vulnerable. And I knew, with sickening certainty, that I was the weakness they'd exploit, the proof that he'd let personal feelings compromise professional judgment, the assistant who'd gone from invisible to indispensable too quickly to be anything but suspicious. The night before the meeting, Elias came to the apartment. He looked exhausted, defeated in a way I'd never seen. He told me Marcus had contacted him privately, made an offer. If Elias stepped back from the reforms, allowed things to return to the previous management style, stopped pushing for accountability at the executive level, Marcus would ensure the allegations about inappropriate relationships went away. Everything could go back to normal. We could even continue seeing each other quietly, as long as Elias stopped trying to change the company culture. Elias had refused, obviously, but the offer had shown him exactly what we were up against. They'd use our relationship as a weapon, turn something genuine into something that looked corrupt, destroy my reputation and his credibility in one strategic move. He asked me a question I'd been dreading. He asked if I thought we should end things, not because he wanted to, but because he couldn't stand the thought of me being collateral damage in his war with the old guard. He said he'd protect me no matter what, but that the best protection might be distance. Public distance, at least, until the situation stabilized. I understood what he was offering. Safety through separation, protection through denial. It was logical, strategic, the smart move. But I'd spent 3 years being invisible, 3 years making myself small to avoid conflict, 3 years choosing safety over everything else, and I was done with that version of myself. I told him no, that I wouldn't hide, that I wouldn't pretend this wasn't real to make other people comfortable, that if we were going down, we'd go down together, but we'd go down honest. That my dignity wasn't just about being treated respectfully by others. It was about respecting myself enough to refuse to be ashamed of something real. I told him I believed in what he was trying to do at Sterling Apex, that the reforms mattered, that holding people accountable for abuse of power mattered, that creating a culture where people like me, people without connections or pedigree or privilege, could succeed based on merit, mattered, and I wasn't going to let Marcus Chen and people like him win by making us afraid. Elias looked at me for a long moment. Then he pulled me close and told me I was the bravest person he'd ever met, that he didn't deserve me but was grateful beyond measure that I'd chosen him anyway, that we'd face the board meeting together and whatever came after, we'd face that together too. The board meeting was scheduled for 2 p.m. By noon, the entire executive floor knew something major was happening. People gathered in clusters, whispers spreading like wildfire. I could feel eyes on me everywhere I went, speculative, curious, some sympathetic, others gleeful at the prospect of drama. Elias asked me to be present at the meeting, not as his assistant taking notes, but as a witness, someone who could speak to the actual changes happening in the company culture, someone who'd experienced both the before and after of his leadership. It was risky, unconventional, exactly the kind of move Marcus would use against him, but it was also honest, transparent. Everything Elias was trying to build the company toward, I said yes. The boardroom was intimidating. Long mahogany table, leather chairs, portraits of company founders staring down with stern expression, 15 board members, most of whom looked at me with barely concealed skepticism when I entered behind Elias. Marcus Chen sat at the far end, looking confident, composed, ready for battle. Next to him were two other executives who'd risen alongside Cassandra, the old guard, making their final stand. The meeting started formally. Marcus outlined his concerns, used carefully neutral language to paint a picture of a young executive making emotionally driven decisions, pointed to metrics that showed client discomfort with recent changes, suggested that perhaps Elias wasn't quite ready for the level of authority he'd been given, that perhaps he needed more guidance from experienced board members, that perhaps some decisions should be reconsidered. It was a masterclass in subtle character assassination, never quite crossing into direct accusation, always maintaining plausible deniability. But the message was clear. Elias Steele was letting personal matters cloud his judgment, and it was time for the adults in the room to take back control. Then it was Elias's turn. He stood, and I could see him gathering himself, finding that core of steel that had allowed him to walk away from this company once and come back on his own terms. That had allowed him to stand up to people who'd helped build his family's empire and tell them they were wrong. He didn't defend himself the way they expected, didn't argue with the metrics or challenge the characterizations. Instead, he did something brilliant. He reframed the entire conversation. He talked about what Sterling Apex had become under the old guard's leadership, a place where abuse of power was tolerated, where people were treated as disposable, where loyalty was demanded but never returned, where the only thing that mattered was profit, regardless of human cost. He showed them documentation they'd never seen. Exit interview data showing why the company had 30% annual turnover. HR complaints that had been systematically buried. Legal settlements paid quietly to avoid publicity. The actual cost of the culture they'd protected, measured not just in human suffering, but in hard financial terms that even the most profit-focused board member had to acknowledge. Then he introduced me, told my story without embellishment. A 3-year employee who'd been subjected to systematic abuse, who'd worked unpaid overtime, who'd been publicly humiliated, who'd been assigned degrading tasks designed solely to reinforce her powerlessness, who'd never complained because she'd been taught that survival meant silence. He explained what had changed after her intervened, how I'd moved from survival mode to actually contributing, how my insights had improved several major projects, how I'd identified efficiency improvements that saved the company money, how I represented exactly the kind of talent the company had been wasting for years by allowing toxic management to thrive. Then he did something I hadn't expected. He addressed the elephant in the room directly, acknowledged that, yes, our relationship had evolved beyond professional, that yes, he cared about me in ways that complicated things, but that those feelings had developed because working together had revealed character, not because he'd been influenced inappropriately, that he'd put safeguards in place to eliminate power dynamics, that he'd offered me career paths that didn't depend on him, that every decision he'd made regarding me had been documented, reviewed, and was available for scrutiny. He told the board they could use our relationship to undermine him if they wanted, could feed it to the rumor mill, could turn something genuine into something that looked corrupt. But in doing so, they'd be validating exactly the kind of culture he was trying to dismantle. A culture where powerful men could abuse women without consequence, but genuine relationships between equals were scandalous. A culture where maintaining appearances mattered more than actual ethics. Then he said something that made my throat tight. He said if the board wanted him to choose between the reforms and his personal life, he'd choose the reforms, that the changes mattered more than his comfort, but that he hoped the board was better than that. That they could see the difference between an executive making poor decisions and an executive trying to do the right thing in a complicated situation. The room was silent when he finished. You could have heard a pin drop. Board members were looking at each other, having silent conversations with their eyes. Marcus looked less confident now, almost cornered. Then the board chair, an older woman named Patricia Lim, who'd been on the board since before Elias was born, spoke. She asked me directly if I felt pressured in any way, if I'd been coerced, if I'd faced retaliation for refusing advances. Her voice was kind but firm. She wanted truth, not performance. I stood, my voice steadier than I expected, told her no. That Elias had never leveraged his position, that he'd been more careful about boundaries than anyone I'd ever worked with, that he'd given me agency when everyone else had taken it away, that yes, we'd developed feelings for each other, but those feelings had grown from mutual respect, not from power imbalance, that I'd chosen him freely, and I'd do it again. Patricia nodded slowly, looked at Marcus, asked him if he had actual evidence of misconduct or just suspicions based on his personal disagreement with management strategy. Marcus hedged, tried to redirect, but she pushed. And eventually, he had to admit he had no evidence of anything inappropriate. Just concerns, just observations. Just a desire to see the company return to its previous trajectory. Patricia smiled thinly, told him his concerns were noted. Then she turned to the full board and made a motion to support Elias's reforms, to give him 2 years to prove the strategy could work, to stop trying to undermine him at every turn and actually work together to build something better, and to mind their own damn business regarding his personal life unless actual misconduct was proven. The motion passed, 11-4. It wasn't unanimous, but it was decisive. The old guard had lost. The aftermath wasn't simple. Marcus Chen resigned 3 days later, citing philosophical differences with current management. 2 other executives followed him. There were think pieces in the business press about generational divides in corporate leadership, about whether reforming toxic culture was realistic or just naive idealism, about whether powerful people could have genuine relationships or if power always corrupted everything it touched. But inside Sterling Apex, things changed. Slowly at first, then with gathering momentum. People started speaking up. HR started actually investigating complaints. Management training was overhauled. Exit interviews were taken seriously. The 30% annual turnover started dropping. Not overnight, but measurably, progressively, provably. The numbers Elias had promised started materializing. Employee engagement increased. Productivity improved. Even client relationships strengthened once people realized the reforms were making Sterling Apex stronger, not weaker. The board noticed. The skeptics had to acknowledge that maybe, just maybe, treating people with dignity was actually good business. For me personally, everything was different. I'd been reassigned to report to the chief of staff, eliminating the direct power dynamic with Elias. I'd been given projects that let me prove myself independently. I enrolled in an executive MBA program that the company was paying for. My salary had more than doubled. My mother's medical bills were no longer drowning me. I'd moved into a real apartment, not the corporate housing, but a place that was actually mine. But the biggest change wasn't any of that. It was internal. I'd stopped being invisible, stopped apologizing for existing, stopped making myself small to make others comfortable. I'd learned that I could be vulnerable without being weak, that I could accept help without losing myself, that I could be loved without becoming dependent. Elias and I navigated our relationship carefully, kept things private at work, made sure people saw my competence independently of our involvement, dealt with gossip by being so boring about it that eventually people moved on to more interesting topics. We had dinner together most nights, spent weekends exploring the city like we were tourists in our own home, talked about futures that included each other without assuming we had to sacrifice our individual identities to build something together. He told me once, late at night, when we were lying in his bed watching the city lights through floor-to-ceiling windows, that I'd saved him, not metaphorically, actually saved him. He said he'd been slowly disappearing into the role of heir apparent, losing himself in expectations and obligations and the weight of legacy, that I'd reminded him who he actually was underneath all of that. That choosing to protect me had been the first decision he'd made in years that was about being human, rather than being strategic. I told him he'd saved me too, that I'd been drowning so slowly I'd forgotten what breathing felt like, that he'd given me back my dignity, my agency, my belief that I deserved more than survival, that loving him had taught me I was capable of being loved, which was something I'd stopped believing years ago. We weren't naive. We knew relationship built in intense circumstances sometimes didn't survive normal life, that we'd have to work at this, that there would be challenges we couldn't anticipate, that some people would always question whether what we had was real or just a byproduct of power dynamics and heightened emotion. But we also knew what we'd been through to get here. The walls we'd torn down, both external and internal, the risks we'd taken, the stand we'd made, that created a foundation that felt solid, real, worth building on. 6 months later, I'm writing this from Elias's office. Well, technically, it's both our offices now. We converted it into a shared workspace when we officially moved in together last month. His desk faces the windows overlooking the city. Mine faces the bookshelves he's been filling with the literature degree I never got to pursue. Sterling Apex just announced its best quarterly results in 5 years. Employee retention is at an all-time high. We're getting applications from top talent who specifically cite our culture reforms as the reason they want to work here. The board is happy, the investors are happy, even the skeptics have mostly come around. But that's not why I'm writing this. I'm writing this because I want to remember this moment, this exact feeling, right now, before it becomes just another part of our history, before it becomes a story we tell at dinner parties or include in company lore. I want to remember what it felt like to go from invisible to seen, from powerless to empowered, from surviving to thriving. I want to remember the exact shade of gray-blue of Elias's eyes when he looked at me in that parking garage and decided I was worth protecting. I want to remember the sound of rain on concrete and the weight of disintegrating boxes, and the moment I realized someone saw me not as a problem to solve, but as a person who mattered. I want to remember that change is possible, that systems can be reformed, that power can be used to protect instead of harm, that people can be better than their worst moments, that love can grow in unexpected places, between unlikely people, despite all the reasons it shouldn't work. I want to remember because there are still so many people like I was, still so many invisible assistants carrying boxes in the rain, enduring public humiliation, convinced they have to accept cruelty as the price of employment, still so many people who've forgotten they deserve dignity, who've stopped believing things can be different, and I want them to know, it can be different. You can stop being invisible. You can demand better. You can find people who see you, who value you, who protect you without diminishing you. You can fall in love with someone who has power without losing yourself. You can build something real in the middle of impossible circumstances. You just have to stop accepting invisibility as your natural state. You have to risk being seen, which means risking being hurt, which means being brave in ways that feel impossible until you do it. But on the other side of that risk is a life that feels like yours. Authentic, messy, complicated, beautiful, real. My name is Aurora Winters. I used to be invisible. Now I'm unforgettable. This is my story, and it's only just beginning.